My twin sister Petra wrote me exactly 112 words. I know because I counted them 3 times on the train, pressing the paper flat against my knee until the crease went soft. 112 words to dismantle the life I thought I understood. 112 words to hand me a woman she had spent 2 years loving. The last line was the one that broke me. She had written it in the careful, looping script she reserved for things she meant. Absolutely. Take her. She will be kinder to you than I have been to myself. I stood on the platform and did not move for 6 minutes. The train left without me. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. I had been working at the Kesford Botanical Institute for 14 months when Petra started bringing Lorelei Ashby around to family dinners. I had been senior garden designer for 8 of those months, which meant I spent most of my working hours in the propagation greenhouse, or crouched in the stone garden with a trowel and a set of plans and the particular satisfaction of turning a landscape drawing into something that actually grew. I was good at my job. Not in the way that required me to talk about it, just in the way that showed up in the results. Lorelei was the Institute's executive director. She had taken the role 2 years before I arrived, which was the same year she and Petra had apparently met at a conservation fundraiser, and by the time I started at Kesford, she and my twin sister were what could only be described as a fact. Not announced, not performed, just present. The kind of relationship that did not need to introduce itself because it had already arranged itself into the structure of both women's lives. I learned about Lorelei Ashby, the professional, before I learned about Lorelei Ashby, the person. The Institute staff spoke about her the way people speak about weather systems, with a combination of respect, wariness, and the resigned acceptance that her decisions were simply the climate in which the work happened. She was 36 years old. She had a PhD in conservation biology, a 2-page list of published research, and a reputation for making difficult funding decisions with a clarity that impressed some people and terrified others. She wore her hair pinned up for most of the working day, dark and slightly wavy, and her eyes were the kind of gray that registers differently depending on the light. I saw her for the first time in a staff meeting in my 3rd week. She was discussing a proposed rewilding expansion in the eastern section, and she was doing it with the particular precision of someone who had thought the subject through completely before opening her mouth. She glanced at me twice, the new hire, the one she had not yet needed to address directly. Both times she looked away before I finished looking at her. I told myself it was professional assessment. She was sizing up the new designer on her team. That was reasonable. That was correct. I told Petra about her at Sunday dinner, and Petra laughed in the way that meant she already knew everything I was about to say. She is something, isn't she? Petra said. She is very good at her job, I said. Petra looked at me across the table with those eyes that were identical to mine and knew every thought I had ever tried to organize into a private place. She is, Petra said. She is also one of the most difficult people to actually know that I have ever met. But you know her, I said. I know some of her, Petra said. She allows a limited amount of knowing, and then she just holds still. She stays absolutely still until she is done. And then she goes, without being frightened. Just because she is done. What thing? Leaves, Petra said. Without being frightened. Just because it was done. I thought about that on the drive home. About what it meant to hold still the way Petra described. About whether that was a quality that could coexist with warmth, or whether it was the absence of warmth organized into something that looked almost enough like it. The next 3 months were professional. Lorelei reviewed my landscape proposals in the quarterly brief with the same precise efficiency she brought to everything. Specific questions, direct feedback, no hedging. She approved the stone garden redesign without qualification and the winter blooming border plan with 2 suggestions that were both right. I implemented the suggestions. She noted the implementation at the next review without particular emphasis. This was the rhythm of working at Kesford, and it suited me. What did not suit me was the increasing frequency of encounters that did not fit inside the professional rhythm. Lorelei walking the grounds at 6:30 in the morning, when she knew I was always in early. Lorelei appearing at the propagation greenhouse during the window of the afternoon when most of the other designers were at their desks. Not often, not predictable. Just present with a regularity that I started to notice, because I am the kind of person who notices regularities whether I want to or not. She never said anything that required me to account for the noticing. She would look at what I was working on. She would ask a question about the plant or the plan or the methodology. She would listen in the complete, unhurried way she listened to things she found worth her attention. And then, she would leave. Ima Selk noticed. Emma had been managing the greenhouses at Kesford for 23 years and had the dry, grounded awareness of a woman who had seen every professional relationship in the building at close range and knew exactly what each of them actually was. She was 57 years old, and she handed me coffee in a ceramic mug every morning, as though this were a contractual obligation, and I had never asked her to stop. "You've got a regular visitor," Emma said to me in December, not looking up from the bench where she was potting on seedlings. "She tours the greenhouse," I said. "She tours all the facilities." "She tours the facilities on Wednesdays," Emma said. "You are open Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. She is specifically here on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons." I had not clocked the specific days. "That's a coincidence," I said. Emma looked up from the bench. Her eyes met mine. "No, it isn't. And you know it isn't." The coffee was hot. I did not say anything else. The Kesford winter was sharp and still. The botanical garden grounds were spare and beautiful in the cold, the bare bones of the deciduous plantings visible in a way they were not in the growing months, the evergreen structure of the design showing through. I walked the grounds most mornings before the staff arrived, taking the kind of notes you can only take in person, the ones that are about the quality of the light and the way the air moved through the spaces between plantings. Lorelei walked the grounds at the same hour, which I had known since my third week, and had adjusted my route to not notice. I had adjusted it with the deliberate honesty of someone who knew exactly why they were adjusting it. In January, she came to find me at the eastern section, where I was assessing the proposed rewilding zone. She had her own plans rolled under her arm, and she came to stand beside me, and we looked at the scrubby winter ground together for a moment before she said anything. She said, "The drainage is the problem." "I know. I've been running the soil tests. The clay sublayer in the northeast quadrant is going to flood it in early spring if we don't cut some gradient." She looked at the plans she had. They were different from mine. Hers were the older versions, the original rewilding proposal from before my hire. She looked at mine, which I held out without being asked. She looked for a long time. Not at me, at the plans. She said, "These are better." "I'm still employed here," I said, presumably because of that. The corner of her mouth moved. One specific movement. I noted it the way I had been noting everything about Lorelei Ashby for 4 months, while understanding that the noting was not a professional activity. She handed the plans back. Her fingers were cold in the January air. For 1 second, in the handoff, our fingers were both on the paper. Neither of us moved away first. The plans changed hands, and we both looked at the ground, and she said, "The gradient solution is in the third sketch. I can see it. That one." I looked at the third sketch. She was right. "That's the one," I said. She nodded. She walked back toward the main building, and I stood in the cold and thought about whether I was going to be able to do this job for much longer without saying something to someone. I said something to Petra. I called her on a Tuesday night in February, when the need to say something had become larger than my ability to manage it alone. I told her about the greenhouse visits. I told her about the morning walk adjustment. I told her about the plans and the cold fingers and the corner of Lorelei's mouth, the one movement. I told her all of it in the careful, factual way I told Petra things I was not ready to name out loud, the way that allowed both of us to pretend we were discussing observable phenomena rather than the state of my heart. Petra was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I know." 2 words. I know. Those 2 words were not casual. I heard the weight in them. It was the knowing of someone who had been sitting with information for a while and had decided the time for holding it privately was ending. "What do you know?" I asked. She said, "Ren." And then she said, "I need some time to think about how to say the rest of this." She did not call back that night. She called back 3 days later, She said, I need to see you in person. Sunday. I came on Sunday. Petra made tea. She always made tea for important conversations, as though the ritual of boiling water bought time to organize the things that needed saying. She poured for both of us, and she sat across from me, and she looked at me with our identical eyes, and she said, Lorelai and I are ending. I stared at her. We have been ending for a while, Petra said. Since summer, honestly. She is very honest about what she can give, and I thought for a long time that I could build a life in the room that honesty allows for. But the room is very specific, and I am a person who needs more room. I did not ask about me. I could not ask about me. I said, I'm sorry. Petra said, you are not the reason. I need you to hear that first. What? You and she. She stopped herself. How you are around each other. That is not the reason we are ending. The reason we are ending is that we have been ending since summer, and I have been trying to make something work that she and I have both known for months does not work. I said nothing. Petra said, she hasn't done anything wrong. She is exactly who she said she was when we met. I just thought I could be someone who was enough for that person. I was wrong about that. And she is too honest to pretend otherwise, and I love her enough to be honest back. The tea cooled between us. Through the window, the February afternoon was flat and gray. Is she? I said, and then I stopped. Because the question was too large, and I did not know which piece of it to ask first. Petra looked at me. She had always been able to do this. Look at me and find the exact thing I was not saying, and say it back to me without armor. She nodded. Yes, she knows you are at Kesford. She has known since October that you are my twin. She has not said anything to me directly. She would never say anything directly. But I know her. Ren. I know her as you come to know someone when you have tried and failed to build something together, and the failure was honest and not anyone's fault. I said, I can't. Petra said, I know you can't. Not now. Not while she and I are still formally anything. And not while you work for her. I am not asking you to do anything. I am telling you what I know, because you called me 3 months ago and couldn't tell me why you were adjusting your morning walk, and I think you deserve to have someone be honest with you about what I can see from where I'm standing. The February light went thin and gray, and then dark. Petra refilled the tea. We talked about other things. Our mother, a trip she was planning, the way the Institute looked in winter, which she had visited once, and found beautiful in the way that things with good bones are beautiful. We did not talk about Lorelai again. We did not need to. I drove home in the dark, and I did not think about what Petra had told me. I thought about it very hard in the way that you think hard about things by refusing to look directly at them. I thought about the stone garden, and the propagation greenhouse, and the eastern rewilding zone, and the third drainage sketch, which was better than the others because the angle of the gradient let the water move where it needed to go instead of building up behind something that wasn't built to hold it. I thought about things that were built to hold water and things that were not. Lorelai and I did not see each other differently in March. She appeared on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I made no further adjustment to my route. The plans for the eastern section progressed through approval, and I began the preliminary site work in the first week of March, when the ground was soft enough to assess without compacting the sublayer. On a Thursday afternoon in the second week of March, she came to the eastern section where I was working, and she stood beside me, as she had stood beside me in January, and we looked at the rewilding zone together without speaking for a while. She said, "The gradient cut is good." "I'm starting the native seed mix next week," I said. "The fritillary populations are 2 miles east. If the meadow reads correctly, they should be colonizing within 2 seasons." She looked at the ground with the same attention she brought to things she was thinking through. She repeated the phrase back to me, "The fritillary populations." I nodded. She looked at me. Something in her look was not about the fritillary populations. She said, "Your twin sister and I have ended our relationship." The air in the eastern section was very still. "I know," I said. She looked at me steadily. She said, "I know that you know. I wanted to say it to you myself so that it came from me." "Why?" I asked. A pause. The long kind, the kind Lorelai used for honest answers. She said, Because the way things become known matters, and I did not want this to be something you only knew from one angle. I stood in the meadow that was not yet a meadow with the native seed order in my jacket pocket and looked at Lorelei Ashby and thought about all the Tuesdays and Thursdays and the morning walks and the cold-fingered plans exchange and the exact movement at the corner of her mouth that I had been cataloging without permission since October. I said, "Thank you for telling me." She nodded. She left. I stood in the eastern section for a long time, looking at the gradient cut and thinking about 2 seasons. April passed. May arrived with the meadow plantings going in. The wild carrot and field, scabious and oxy daisy, and the ragged robin that would bring the pollinators and eventually the fritillaries if the meadow read right. I knelt in the new-turned earth for long days. My hands were stained with loam, and my knees were permanently damp. I was very good at this. I had always been very good at this. Bastian Rowe was the Institute's junior botanist, 24 years old and enthusiastic in the specific way of someone who has not yet learned to temper enthusiasm with the awareness that not everyone in the room shares it. He came to help with the meadow planting on a Thursday in May because the propagation schedule had him free, and he wanted to learn the wildflower seeding methodology. He was a willing, attentive helper, and he also, after 2 hours of companionable work, said with the open directness of someone who had not yet learned to think before speaking, "I think Dr. Ashby likes coming to this section." I kept seeding. "She tours all the sections," I said. He squinted at the ground. "I suppose, but she comes here like it's her favorite place. She doesn't look at the ground when she's in the other sections. Here she looks at the ground, she looks at the plans, and then she looks at you. It's different." I said nothing. He added, thoughtfully, as though helping, "I don't think it's about the meadow, Bastian," I said. "The fritillary population 2 miles east needs something to colonize in the next 2 seasons. Focus on the seed placement." He focused on the seed placement, but the words were in the air, the way his words always were, unguarded, accurate, impossible to unsay. I called Petra that evening. I told her what Bastian had said. I told her the way I told Petra things, factually, without the emotional register, the way that allowed both of us to understand what I was actually saying. Petra said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need to know if she would have said any of this to you. About me. Before you ended. I need to know if I'm constructing something out of Tuesdays and Thursdays." Petra was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "She did not say your name to me. She is not the kind of person who says things she is not ready to say. But Ren, there are things she does not say that are louder than most people's announcements." I said, "I work for her." "I know," Petra said. I said, "Nothing can happen while I work for her." "I know," Petra said. I said, "And she would never say anything because she would never do anything while I work for her." "I know," Petra said. She said it quietly. Then she said, "Get some sleep. Let the meadow do its work." The meadow was doing its work. By late May, the first growth was visible, the rosette stage of the biennial species coming up in the darker soil patches where the seeding density had been highest. The fritillaries would not come this season, but the foundation was there. You could see it if you knew what to look for. June was warm. The Institute's summer visiting program brought school groups through 3 days a week, and the grounds were full in the mornings of children discovering plants, with the specific delight of people encountering something they had not known they needed to encounter. I worked around the school groups with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to navigating a professional space that occasionally became a public one. On a Wednesday evening, in the first week of June, when the school groups had gone and the staff was thinning toward the end of the working day, Lorelei came to the stone garden where I was finishing the last of the late-season replanting. She came later than Tuesdays and Thursdays, later than the morning walks, later than any of the patterns I had established as the structure of her attention. She stood at the gate of the stone garden, and she did not come through it. I looked up. She said, "I want to have an honest conversation." I set the trowel down, sat back on my heels. "All right," I said. She said, "I am aware that the current professional structure does not permit certain conversations. I am not here to have one of those conversations." I am here because I think it would be unfair to let the summer pass without acknowledging that I have been dishonest with you by omission, and I would like to correct that. I waited. She said, I have been aware of you since October, not in a professional capacity only. I should have managed that awareness with more rigor than I have. The Tuesday and Thursday visits. They were not random. I know, I said. She held my gaze. Her shoulders did not move. Her face was composed in the specific way it composed itself when she was being completely honest about something that cost her to say. She said, I am not going to act on anything while you work here. I want to be clear about that. I am also not going to pretend the reason I am not acting on it is only professional discretion. It is discretion, and it is, she paused, the right thing. I stood up. I was still holding the trowel. I did not know where to put it. I said, I appreciate you telling me, she said. I did not tell you so that you would appreciate it. I told you because you have been walking around this institute for 7 months, adjusting your route and pretending not to notice things, and you deserve not to be left adjusting your route indefinitely without knowing what the route is, being adjusted around. That is the most useful thing anyone has said to me in this conversation, I said. Something in her face shifted. Not the composed version. The other version. The one I had been noting in millimeters for months. She said, Good night, Ren. She used my first name. She always used Calder in professional settings. Always the last name, in the clean professional distance she maintained with everyone on her team. My first name in her mouth was not a slip. It was exactly what it was. She walked back toward the main building. I stood in the stone garden with my trowel and my hands full of loam and thought about the right thing, about who decides what is right, about whether the right thing and the honest thing are always the same thing. I called Petra. Petra listened to all of it, the stone garden, the first name, the route. Then she said, What do you want? I want her, I said. For the first time, I said it without the qualifier, without the professional frame, or the adjustment, or the because she's your director, or the because she was Petra's. Just, I want her. And I have wanted her since October, and I have been building a meadow 40 feet from where she stands on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I don't know what to do with that. Petra was quiet. Then she said, I'm going to write her a letter. Me to her, not to you. I need you to know I'm going to do this. I said, Petra, she said. Not for you, for her, and for me. Because there are things I know about both of you that neither of you has said to the other person yet, and I think someone should say them, and I am the only person who can say them without it meaning the thing it would mean if you said it. I said, Don't. She said, I love you, go to sleep. She wrote the letter. She sent it to Lorelei. She did not show me what it said. 3 weeks passed. The longest 3 weeks of the botanical calendar, the height of summer when the Institute's gardens were at their most spectacular, and I was doing the most complex maintenance work of the year. I walked the stone garden in the mornings. I did not see Lorelei on the new Tuesdays. I did not see her on the Thursdays. The pattern had stopped, quietly. The way patterns stop when the people maintaining them have understood something new and are waiting for the dust to settle. Ima Selk handed me my coffee on a Friday morning in July and said, without looking up from the bench, The director has been putting in very long days. Has she? I said. She was in the greenhouse at 7 this morning, Ima said. Which is a thing she has done before and a thing she has not done in 3 weeks. Make of that what you will. I made something of it. I let myself make something of it for approximately 30 seconds, and then I went back to the summer maintenance schedule and made nothing of it for the rest of the morning. Lorelei found me in the propagation greenhouse at 2 in the afternoon. She stood in the doorway for a moment before she came in. She was wearing a gray shirt with the sleeves pushed up and her hair was down, not pinned, just down, which I had never seen in a work setting in 14 months and which was, in the warm greenhouse air, an extraordinary detail. She came to stand 2 benches away. She picked up a label from the bench and looked at it and put it down. I said, I know Petra wrote to you. She said, Yes. I said, She didn't tell me what she said. She set the label down carefully. She said, I know. She told me she hadn't. What did she say? I asked. Lorelei looked at me. she said, that she had loved me honestly and that I had loved her honestly, and that we had been honest enough with each other to know when what we had was the end of itself. And that there is a person who is not her who she has watched learn every path and growing cycle on these grounds for 14 months, and she believes that person deserves to be seen the same way she was seen completely. Not in passing, not around a professional structure. I held a seedling I had been transplanting, she said. She also said that if I was going to spend 2 more years being careful on Tuesdays and Thursdays, she was going to come down here and remove the actual obstacle herself, which I believe was a sisterly way of telling me I was being a coward. I set the seedling down. Lorelei said. She was not wrong. I looked at her. Her hair was down. The greenhouse was warm with the accumulated heat of a July afternoon, and the green smell of living things in close quarters, the damp soil smell that I associated with the best parts of any day. She was standing 2 benches away. She said, I cannot change the professional structure today. I want you to know that I am not comfortable with the way the current structure limits this conversation. I want to address it. What does addressing it look like? I asked. She said, it is a process, a governance process. A conflict of interest disclosure, and a reporting structure review, and the kind of organizational honesty that I owe to this institution and to you. It is not quick. It is not romantic. I said, I didn't think it would be romantic. I said it without irony. She looked at me. 1 more millimeter. In the corner of her mouth. The catalog entry I had been keeping for 10 months. She said, I will begin the process on Monday. I want you to know before I begin it. I want the knowing to come from me. I said. You already said that to me. In the stone garden. She said, I know. I have apparently made a practice of telling you things before I do them. I think I find it important that you know things are coming rather than arriving at them without warning. Why? I asked. Because she said, because you adjust your route when you don't know things. And I don't want you to have to adjust anything, because of me. The greenhouse was very warm. The July afternoon pressed against the glass. I said, You're going to make me wait. She said, The governance process takes 4 to 6 weeks. I said, I know. You're still going to make me wait. She held my gaze. Yes, I am. I picked the seedling back up. I said, You were right about the 3rd drainage sketch. It was the best one. She said, I know. That was when I realized you were very good at understanding where things need to go. She left. I stood in the warm greenhouse with the seedling in both hands and thought about patience. About the 4 to 6 weeks that a governance process takes when it is done correctly. About what it meant that she had come in the middle of a July afternoon with her hair down to tell me it was beginning. I thought about Petra's letter. About the 112 words I had not read. About the fact that Petra had looked at me across every Sunday dinner table for 14 months and known exactly what I was not saying and had written the letter anyway. My twin sister had done the thing I could not do. She had said the thing that needed saying, and she had said it to the person who needed to hear it, and she had done it at a cost to herself that I was still not fully able to measure. The seedling in my hands was a Fritillaria meleagris, the snake's head fritillary that the eastern meadow was being built to receive. Pale, purple, checkerboard-petaled, dependent on exactly the right conditions, not fragile, just specific. I transplanted it into the prepared tray. I made sure the conditions were right. I went home and I did not call Petra because there was nothing new to say. I poured a glass of water and I sat at my kitchen table with the July evening coming through the window, and I thought about 4 to 6 weeks and what they felt like from inside them. 2 days later, a letter arrived from Petra. Paper. Not a message. Her handwriting, the careful looping one she used for things she meant absolutely. I put it on the table and looked at it for 10 minutes before I opened it. It was 112 words. She had written about the thing that had ended with Lorelei. She had written that the ending was right and that she was not in pain about it, which was true in the specific way that some endings are true. Not painless, but correct. She had written that she had seen the way Lorelei looked at the ground and the plans and then at me, and that she recognized the looking because she had been the recipient of something like it once and she knew what it meant when it was real. And then the last line, the one I had read on the train 3 days later and counted 3 times. Take her. She will be kinder to you than I have been to myself. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then I folded the letter along the crease that was already going soft, and I thought about what it means to be given something, not as a handoff, not as a transaction, as a gift from someone who knew the value of the thing they were giving and chose to give it anyway. The 4 weeks passed. They passed the way the season passed in a botanical garden. Not quickly, but visibly. Every week showing something different in the progress of the growing things. The meadow in the eastern section was changing. The biennial rosettes were establishing. The perennial root systems were going down into the gradient-cut soil that let the water move where it needed to go. I walked the grounds every morning, and the mornings were different without the specific quality of someone else's attention moving through the same space. Emma Selk, in the 5th week, handed me my coffee and said, "The director asked me this morning what your schedule looks like in the afternoons." I looked at her. "I told her you're usually free on Tuesdays and Thursdays," Emma said, without any inflection at all. I said, "That is the most significant thing you have ever said to me." Emma said, "I've been saying significant things to you for 14 months. You just haven't been ready to hear all of them." She went back to the bench. I drank my coffee. On the Tuesday of the 6th week, Lorelei came to the propagation greenhouse at 2 in the afternoon. She was in the gray shirt again. Her hair was down again. She came to stand at the bench where I was working and she said, "The governance review was completed on Friday. A conflict of interest management plan has been filed. Your reporting line has been moved to the head of collections, formally documented, clean." I set down what I was holding. She said, "I am no longer your direct supervisor, as of last Friday." "I know," I said. "Ima told me." "Of course she did," Lorelei said. I said, "What happens now?" She said, "Now I would like to ask you to dinner." I said, "Yes." She stood very still for one moment. Then she moved from 2 benches away to 1 bench away. She said, "I read your twin sister's letter 8 times." I said, "I read mine 3. I know the word count." Something in her face did the thing it had been doing in millimeters for 10 months, and then it did it more than a millimeter. All at once, patient for exactly long enough and done with the patience. She said, "You have been adjusting your route since October." I said, "I stopped adjusting it eventually." She said, "I know. I noticed when you stopped." I looked at her. In the warm greenhouse, in the 5th week of July, with the growing things all around us, and the fritillary seedlings in their prepared trays, and the eastern meadow out the glass doing the slow work of establishing itself, I looked at Lorelei Ashby, who was no longer my director, and who had begun a governance process on a Monday in July, because she did not want to arrive at things without warning. I stepped around the bench. The space between us was not large. She did not move back. She said, "Dinner is on Thursday." I said, "Thursday is good." She looked at me for 1 second that was not about the greenhouse or the governance process, or the planning sketches, or any of the 14 months of managed distance. It was the 1 second where she stopped managing. Her hand came up and rested against my jaw. Warm, still, the touch of someone who was not rushing anything. She said, "Your sister was right about the kindness." I said, "She usually is." Then she kissed me. Patient. Unhurried. The exact measure of something that had been held back for 10 months and had decided the holding was finished. She tasted of the afternoon and the greenhouse warmth and something quieter underneath. Something that had been there since October, organized and waiting. I put my hands on her waist. She made a small sound against my mouth that I had never heard from her before, in any register, in any version of the careful distance she had maintained. The sound of something released. We stayed like that for a long time. The greenhouse hummed around us. The fritillary seedlings were in their trays. Outside, the eastern meadow was doing its slow and patient work. When she stepped back, her eyes were different. Still gray, still reading everything, but open in a way they had not been in any of the months before this one. "Thursday. Thursday," I said. She left. I stood in the greenhouse and looked at the fritillary seedlings and thought about 2 seasons. About the kind of growing that takes exactly the right conditions and happens in exactly the right time. Through the glass, the evening was coming in warm and gold over the meadow. And somewhere in the east, 2 miles away, a fritillary population was doing its slow work of waiting for the right place to land. The Thursday dinner was at a place Lorelei had chosen. I knew she had chosen it because when I arrived, she was already seated, and the table was in a corner, and the lighting was the particular warm amber of rooms where someone has thought about the quality of the evening rather than just the food. She stood when she saw me come through the door. She was wearing a charcoal dress that I had never seen before, and her hair was down, as it had been in the greenhouse, and I understood, arriving at the table, that the hair was a deliberate choice, a private version of herself, offered without announcement. She said, "I wasn't sure what you preferred to eat." I said, "I eat everything." She said, "Good. I ordered wine." I did not know if that was presumptuous. I sat down. The wine was already poured, a dry, white, pale in the candlelight. I picked up my glass, and she picked up hers, and for a moment we simply sat with them without drinking. I said, "You have been precise about a great many things over the past year." She said, "I have," I said. "The governance process, the disclosure, the reporting structure, all of it handled correctly." She held her glass with both hands. She said, "I wanted the ground to be clean." "I understand that," I said. She looked at me. Her eyes in this light were different from the greenhouse, different from the meadow and the stone garden. All those places had the texture of work, even when the work was not what was actually happening between us. Here, there was no professional frame-machine around her. She was simply a woman in a charcoal dress across a table from me, and the absence of the frame was something I needed a moment to account for. She said, "Petra told me you count things when you're processing something difficult." I looked at her. "What else did she tell you?" She said, "That you adjust your route, that you take notes on paper when you are not ready to say the thing you are thinking, that you have always been the twin who held the information longest before acting on it." I said, "She told you a great deal." She said, 112 words. She told me everything in 112 words, and then wrote me a letter that I have read 8 times, and that told me the same things in a different register. I picked up my fork and then put it down because I did not want to eat yet. I wanted to ask the thing I had been holding since July. I said, "Did you know? Before Petra wrote to you, did you know what she was going to say?" She thought about this honestly. She did not reach for the fast answer. She said, "I knew that she and I were ending. I knew that the ending was correct and not a failure. I knew, by October of last year, that there was something specific in the way I moved through this building that had changed, and that the change corresponded to a specific arrival. I did not allow myself to name the correspondence. I said, 'Because of Petra,'" she said, "because of Petra, and because of the professional structure, and because I have learned, over time, that naming things prematurely costs more than waiting until the name is the right one." I said, "And now?" She looked at me across the table. The candlelight was doing something particular to the gray of her eyes. She said, "Now the name is the right one." The food arrived. She had ordered well. The bread came first, warm and dense, with oil and salt, and she tore a piece and I tore a piece and we ate it without ceremony, which was itself a form of intimacy, the casualness of a shared meal that was not performing anything for anyone. She told me about the conservation project that had occupied her first year at Kesford before I arrived, a woodland corridor initiative in the north of the county, still ongoing. She described the politics of it, the 3 different land stakeholders whose disagreements had made the initial corridor planning take twice as long as it should have. She described it with the particular animation that came into her face when she was talking about work she cared about. Not the composed directorial version, the version underneath. I told her about the stone garden redesign, the early sketches I had done on the train during my first month, because I could see what the garden needed before I had the standing to say so. I told her about the fritillary meadow, the 2-season investment, the gamble of the native seed mix in a space that had been managed lawn for 15 years. I told her about Bastian and what he had said. She said, "I owe Bastian Rowe a debt of gratitude." I said, "I told him to focus on the seed placement." She said, and yet, I said, "We stayed 2 hours. When the plates were cleared, she ordered tea, which arrived in a small white pot, and she poured for both of us with the same unhurried attention she brought to everything, and I watched her hands and thought about the greenhouse and her hand at my jaw and the first kiss, which I had replayed in a very specific and detailed way, approximately 40 times in the past 48 hours. She set her cup down. She said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it before we leave this table, because I think it requires a table and a public space and the specific accountability of a room where both of us are visible." I waited. She said, "I handled the past year poorly in the ways that mattered most. I maintained the right professional structure. I disclosed when I should have disclosed. But I also monitored you with an attention that you did not ask for and that I did not make transparent to you. And I allowed that attention to exist in the space between us as something you had to read and interpret without any assistance from me. That was not fair. You should not have had to adjust your route because I was unwilling to say the thing that would have made the adjustment unnecessary." I looked at her. She said, "I am not apologizing for the process. The process was right. I am apologizing for the year of managing something alone that I should have found a way to name sooner, even in a limited form, so that you were not navigating a landscape I had arranged without telling you what it was." I said, "Petra's letter handled it." She said, "Petra's letter was generous beyond what she owed either of us. I am aware of that. It does not make the prior year my credit." I said, "I know. I'm not saying it does. I'm saying that the outcome is what it is. And I'm sitting across a table from you in a public restaurant and you have poured me tea, and we are both here deliberately, and I'm not measuring the cost of the year against the fact of right now." She looked at me for a long time. She said, "That is the kindest thing you could have said." I said, "I know." I thought about it on the walk over. The corner of her mouth moved, significantly, more than a millimeter. We walked out into the September evening, which was the first cool night after the summer, the air carrying the specific clarity that arrives in early autumn when the warmth has stored itself away and you can smell the soil again. She walked beside me. Our arms were close without touching. She said, "Can I walk you home?" "I live 12 minutes from here," I said. She said, "I know." We walked the 12 minutes. She knew the route, which meant she had been here before, in her own mapping of the neighborhood, and I thought about what it meant that she had learned the route to my street before she had any legitimate reason to walk it. At my door I turned. She was standing at the correct distance of someone who had spent a year managing correct distances and was not going to stop being careful just because we had reached a door. I said, "You can come in." She said, "I don't want to assume." I said, "You are not assuming. I am telling you." She looked at me. Then she came through the door. My flat was the flat I had been in for 2 years, accumulated by the particular process of a person who lives alone and likes plants and has opinions about light. There were potted things everywhere, the propagation overflow from the institute, supplemented by the personal collection I kept alive on the south-facing windowsill. A fern in the bathroom. A small olive tree in the corner that was theoretically too large for a flat but that I had refused to part with since the year I bought it as a 4-inch cutting. Lorelei came inside and stopped in the middle of the room and looked at the plants. She said, "You have a fritillaria here." "On the windowsill," I said. "The one I took from the propagation batch." She went to look at it. She was standing at my windowsill in my flat, looking at a snake's head fritillary in a terracotta pot, and her hair was down and the streetlight was coming through the glass, and I understood, standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the sitting room, that the careful time was completely over. I said, "Lorelei." She turned. I crossed the room. I took her face in both hands, very carefully, because she deserved that carefulness after the year we had been in. Her eyes were at my level, open and reading, as they always read everything, but reading me now instead of a landscape plan, or a governance document, or a meadow schematic. I said, "I want to be very clear about what I'm doing." She said, "You are being very clear." I kissed her. Not the first kiss in the greenhouse, which had been the release of 10 months. This was something else. This was chosen, with full knowledge, in a room that was mine, with the September evening outside the window and a fritillary on the sill, and the accumulated patience of a year being set down because it had done its work and was no longer needed. She kissed me back with the same quality, chosen and unhurried, her hands coming to rest at my waist and staying there, and the steadiness of her hands was something I had not expected and felt all the way through me. We stayed close for a moment after. Her forehead came to rest against mine. She was very still. Not the composed stillness of the coaching box, or the boardroom, or the governance review. The stillness of someone who was simply in a moment and did not want to move out of it. She said quietly. "I have wanted to do that since October. Of last year?" I said. She said, "Of last year." I said, "You are very patient." She said, "Not naturally, by effort." I said, "Do you want tea?" She said, "Yes." I made tea. She sat on the kitchen bench and watched me do it, which was something she had apparently decided she was allowed to do, now that she was in my flat, and the governance process was behind us, and the year was behind us, and the Thursday dinner was behind us. She watched me move around the kitchen with the specific attention she brought to things she was interested in, which I was apparently now among, openly, without the professional structure requiring her to manage the attention into something more neutral. I brought the mugs over. We sat on either side of the kitchen table and drank tea and talked until 11, which was when she looked at the clock and said she should go because she had a board call at 7 in the morning that she needed to prepare for, and she said it without any of the formal distance. Just the honest logistics of two people who had full and separate lives and were learning to navigate them together. I walked her to the door. She said, "I would like to do this again." I said, "Thursday." She said, "Thursday is now our standing arrangement, then." I said, "Thursday is our standing arrangement." She put her hand briefly on my jaw, the same touch as the greenhouse but reversed, me at the door and her at the threshold, and I leaned into it for exactly the second it lasted. She left. I stood in the flat with the September evening outside, and the olive tree in the corner, and the fritillary on the windowsill, and thought about standing arrangements. About the governance process, and the disclosure, and the meadow in its second season of establishment, and the 112 words that had arrived on a Tuesday in July, and been read on a train until the crease went soft. I thought about kindness, about what Petra had said it would look like, about whether this, the Thursday, and the tea, and the hand at the jaw, was what she had meant. I thought it was exactly what she had meant. Thursday came, then the Thursday after. Then the Thursdays stopped being counted because there were other evenings in between, and the Thursdays were still ours, but they were not the only containers anymore. October arrived with the meadow entering its second autumn. The biennial rosettes were fully established now, the overwintering root systems well into the gradient-cut soil. This was the season when you had to trust the work already done, as you always had to trust it, the work that was invisible and underground, and showed nothing of itself until the spring it had been building toward. Lorelei walked the meadow with me on a Saturday in mid-October. Not a working Saturday. A morning where neither of us was on institute time, and we had come in through the side gate with coffees from the place on the corner, and we walked the eastern section in the thin autumn light, and she was in dark jeans and a jacket, and her hair was loose. She said, "2 seasons." I said, "Next spring, if the conditions held." She looked at the ground with the attention she brought to things she was genuinely invested in. She crouched down and looked at one of the established rosettes without touching it. She said, "It's already there, you can see it." "I know," I said, "you can see it when you know what to look for." She stood up. She took my hand. Not as a statement, not as a thing for anyone to see. We were alone in the October meadow, and she took my hand and held it, which she did now, with the same quiet certainty she had brought to everything about the past month, the certainty of someone who had learned that the things most worth having were worth holding without apology. We finished the coffees at the far end of the eastern section, where the gradient cut was most visible in the ground. She leaned against the fence post with her shoulder against mine. The autumn was thin and gold and very still. She said, "I called Petra." I turned to look at her. She said, "Last week?" I wanted to say thank you to her directly. Not for me. For the fact that she knew you well enough to know what the letter would do, and she wrote it anyway. What did Petra say? I asked. She said she had known for some time that what she and I had was a different shape than what you and I might have. She said she wanted you to have the right shape. I looked at the meadow. She said. She also said she was coming to visit in November and that she expected to meet me properly, with dinner and full conversation, not just as an abstract person in a governance document. I laughed. That sounds like her, I said. Lorelei said. She also said to tell you that the crease in the letter is your fault for reading it that many times. I stood in the October meadow, with Lorelei's shoulder against mine, and felt something arrange itself into the correct shape, the way the drainage had arranged itself along the gradient cut, the water going where it was designed to go, instead of building up behind something that could not hold it. November came. Petra came with it. She arrived on a Friday afternoon, and I picked her up from the station, and for a moment, when she got off the train, we stood on the platform and looked at each other with our identical faces, and she looked at me very carefully, the same assessing look she always gave me when she was deciding whether I was all right. She said, "You look different." I said, "It's been 4 months." She said, "Not 4 months different. Different. I said, "Let's get you settled and then we'll have dinner with Lorelei." She picked up her bag. She said, "I am going to be extremely well behaved at dinner." I said, "That has never once been true in our lives." She said, "I am going to be extremely well behaved at dinner, and then I am going to ask her very pointed questions about the governance process." I said, "You are not." She said, "I absolutely am." She was, in fact, very well behaved at dinner. Lorelei had chosen a place again, a different restaurant, a small Italian one, that turned out to have been her neighborhood place for 6 years, which was a piece of personal geography I had not known, and which she offered without making a thing of it. Petra was warm and direct and curious, genuinely curious as she always was, and she asked Lorelei about the Conservation Corridor project with a genuine interest that I recognized as real rather than performed, because Petra could not perform interest that she did not feel. Lorelei, for her part, was different at this dinner than she had been at ours, not less composed, differently composed. The composure of someone who had already decided this evening was allowed to be itself, rather than managed into safety. Partway through, Petra looked at Lorelei and said, "The letter, did I say the right things?" Lorelei looked at her. She said, "You said everything." Petra said, "I worried I overstepped." Lorelei said, "You said what needed saying to the person who needed to hear it. That is not overstepping. That is knowing your sister." Petra looked at me, then back at Lorelei. She said, "She counts things when she's anxious. Did she tell you that?" "She told me," Lorelei said. "She folds letters until the paper goes soft," Petra said. "I know," Lorelei said. "She takes notes on paper when she's not ready to say the thing she's thinking." "I know that too," Lorelei said, quietly. With the small, particular warmth that I had been learning to recognize as hers, the version that was not public, Petra looked at her for a moment. She said, "Good." She handed Lorelei the bread basket. "Good." After dinner, Petra and I walked back through the November streets, while Lorelei went home in the other direction. Petra walked with her hands in her pockets, and she was quiet for half a block, which meant she was organizing something. She said, "She looks at you the right way. You deserve that." I said, "I know." She said, "I needed to see that in person. In a room, not just because I knew it was true, but because I needed to see it with my own eyes." "I know," I said. She said, "Are you happy?" I said, "Yes, genuinely." She said, "Good." She walked another half a block. She said, "The letter was 14 drafts, by the way. The final version was 112 words because that was the number where everything was said and nothing was wasted." I stopped walking. She looked at me. I said, "You counted them." She said, "Of course I counted them. You count things. I count things. We are the same person in different bodies." I said, "We are not the same person." She said, We are not the same person, and we are the same person, and you know what I mean. I did know what she meant. Winter arrived the way winters arrive in botanical gardens, removing the disguise the growing season provides and showing the underlying structure, the bone of things. The deciduous sections were bare, and the evergreen plantings were dominant, and the stone garden had its particular winter face, the design visible in a way that the summer softened. I walked it in the mornings as I always had. Lorelei walked with me twice a week now. Not always, not as a rule, but as the natural rhythm that had developed. She had her early calls and her board commitments and her conservation project meetings, and I had my design work and my propagation schedules and the ongoing maintenance calendar, and the walks existed in the space where those things were not, which was a better space than it might have been because both of us had lived with structure long enough to know how to make it accommodate what mattered. On a December morning, she was walking beside me through the deciduous section when she stopped at a particular rowan tree that I had planted the previous autumn in the replanting of the eastern border. She stood and looked at it. She said, "How old was this when you put it in?" 3 years, I said, from the nursery on the North Road. I wanted something that could take the east wind without staking in the second winter. She looked at the bare branches. She said, "It's doing well." "I know," I said. "You can see it in the branch angles. It's been putting weight on." She turned to look at me. She said, "I have been thinking about something." I said, "Tell me." She said, "The east wind resistance, the thing you chose the tree for." I waited. She said, "I think I have been choosing things for east wind resistance for most of my professional life. Choosing the structures and the processes and the correct distances because they are the things that can take what comes without needing to be staked in the second winter. And I think the past year, this year, you specifically, have been showing me that the east wind resistance is real and it is good, and it is not the only thing worth choosing for." I looked at her. She said, "I am not making a speech. I am telling you that I have understood something this year that I did not understand before, which is the difference between being capable of withstanding difficulty and being built to receive something good. I thought they were the same quality. They are not." The December morning was cold and clear around us. The rowan tree was bare and doing well. I said, "I know the difference." She said, "I know you do. You planted the meadow for the fritillaries. 2 seasons of work for something that was going to arrive when it was ready. That is not east wind resistance. That is something else entirely." I said, "It's the same soil." She looked at me. I said, "The same gradient cut, the same drainage system. You can grow both in the same ground if you do the preparatory work. The meadow doesn't need different soil than the east wind tree. It needs the water to move correctly." She held my gaze for a long moment. Then she took my hand, as she did now, with the quiet certainty that had become hers. She said, "You are very good at your job." I said, "I know." She said it in the voice that meant it was about more than the job. I said it in the voice that meant I knew. We walked back toward the main building in the December cold, her hand in mine, the bare bones of the garden visible all around us, and I thought about the first Thursday and the governance process and the 112 words and the crease in the paper that was my fault for reading it that many times. Christmas approached. Lorelei worked through most of it, as she always did, the conservation project requiring end-of-year reporting that fell in the holiday window. I worked through the first half and took the second half to visit my mother, who was in Bristol and who I had been meaning to see since September and had repeatedly delayed because September had become October and October had become November, with the quality of time that moves faster than you expect when you are actually living inside something rather than waiting for it. My mother asked about the institute. She asked about my work. She asked, with the particular maternal precision of a woman who had raised twins and understood the specific information economy between us, what Petra had said about my life these days. I said, "Petra is pleased with how things are going." My mother said, "Petra sounded pleased when she called in November." I said, "Petra called you about dinner?" My mother said, "Petra calls me about everything. She said you have found someone." I said, "I have." My mother waited. I said, "She is the director of the institute. She is 36. She is the most precise person I have ever met, and also, when she is not being precise at me professionally, one of the most genuinely interesting people I have spent time with. She walks the grounds with me in the mornings. She chose the rowan tree in the eastern border before I planted it, which she does not know yet. My mother said, the one she is walking past on her way in. I said, yes. My mother said, tell her about the tree. I said, I will. My mother said, and tell me something, is she kind? I thought about Lorelei in the greenhouse with her hair down. The governance process filed on a Monday because she did not want me to arrive at things without warning. The Thursday dinner and the tea poured correctly, and the hand at my jaw at the door. The October morning with the coffees and the meadow and the shoulder against mine at the fence post. I said, she is exactly as kind as Petra said she would be. My mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, good, that is the thing that matters. I came back from Bristol in the first week of January. Lorelei met me at the station, which was not something I had asked for and which she had arranged because she wanted to and because, as she said when I came through the barrier, the governance review had concluded 6 months ago and she was allowed to meet people at stations now. I said, you were always allowed to meet people at stations. She said, I mean, I am allowed to want to. We took the bus back because the bus went past the Institute grounds on the eastern boundary, and in the January morning light, the meadow was visible from the upper deck, the dormant plants invisible from this distance but the shape of the ground telling its own story, the gradient cut visible in the slope of the light. She said, next spring. I said, next spring. She put her head against my shoulder. I looked out at the January meadow, and thought about timing and the specific patience of things that are building toward a season. February was when the first sign appeared. It was a Wednesday morning, early, the light barely up, and I was in the eastern section before anyone else because I had been watching the weather and I knew the temperature differential from the past week was the kind that accelerated the progression in the biennial cohort. I stood at the edge of the meadow and looked. The early basil growth was there, thin, barely visible. But there, the specific green of fritillaria coming up in the places where the drainage gradient had been correct and the seeding density had been right. I stood in the February morning and looked at it for a long time. Then I took out my phone and I called Lorelei. She answered on the second ring. I said, come to the eastern section. Come now if you can. She said, give me 5 minutes. She was there in 4. She came through the gate in her coat with her hair not yet pinned, because it was early and she had come from the main building, still in the process of her mourning, and she walked to where I was standing, and she looked at where I was looking. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, there it is. Yes, I said. She looked at the new growth for a long time. She said, you planted this in year 1 with a 2-season timeline, and here it is at year 2.5 in February. I said, it took its time. She said, it took exactly the time it needed. She put her arm through mine. We stood at the edge of the meadow in the February morning and watched the new growth in the early light. And the cold was sharp, and the ground smelled of the specific winter to spring turn, earth and frost, and something coming through. And there was no professional frame around us, and no governance structure required, and no root adjustment necessary. There was just the meadow doing what it had always been going to do, and the two of us standing in it. She said, next spring, the fritillaries will come. I said, they were always coming, they just needed the right place. She turned to look at me. Her eyes in the February light were different from every other version of them I had catalogued across the 1.5 years since October. Open. Completely. She said, Wren? I said, yes. She said, thank you for planting the meadow. I said, thank you for approving the budget. She made a sound that was as close to a laugh as she came. In moments she was feeling something deeply. Then she kissed me there, in the February morning at the edge of the meadow, with the first green of the fritillaries coming up in the ground around us, and I kissed her back in the February cold, with both hands on her face, and the cold did not matter. And the early hour did not matter, and the governance timeline and the year of adjustment and the 112 words and the crease in the paper did not matter, because all of those things had brought us to this specific piece of ground in this specific morning, and That was exactly where we were supposed to be. When we stepped back, her nose was cold against my cheek. She said, "I need to go to the 7 o'clock board call." I said, "I know." She said, "I will see you tonight." I said, "Tonight?" She walked back toward the main building. At the gate she turned once and looked at me, and I looked at her, and then she went through it, and the gate closed behind her. I stood in the February meadow alone for a while. The new growth was still there, very thin and very green in the morning light, doing its quiet and patient work. In 3 months, in a good spring, the first flowers would come, purple checked, nodding on their stems, exactly what the whole design had been for. I thought about Petra on the platform with her letter that had cost her something real and been exactly right. About the 112 words written in 14 drafts until nothing was wasted. About the last line she had written in the careful looping script she reserved for things she meant absolutely. Take her. She will be kinder to you than I have been to myself. Petra had been right. She usually was. She and I were the same person in different bodies and the same person in entirely different bodies, and both of those things were true. I had taken her. And Petra had been right about the kindness. The February morning was cold and getting lighter. The institute was waking up around me, sounds beginning in the main building, the day beginning its own slow growth. I had a propagation schedule to run, and a border redesign to finalize, and a Thursday standing arrangement that was now simply part of the shape of my life. The same way the morning walks were part of the shape of my life, and the stone garden and the eastern meadow and the rowan tree in the eastern border were part of the shape of my life. I picked up my bag. I walked back toward the building. At the door I looked back once at the meadow. The new growth was small and certain in the February ground. It was going to be a good spring.